Why is there a voting gender gap? For a long time, I've heard that in the United States, women are more likely to vote Democrat and men are more likely to vote Republican. Now, of course, when I say more likely, I am definitely not saying every man every time votes Republican or that every woman every time votes Democrat, just that that's how men and women tend to lean. For example, in 2019, 56% of women identified or leaned Democrat, but only 38% of women identified or leaned Republican. In contrast, 42% of men identified or leaned Democrat, while 50% of men identified or leaned Republican. And scholars who study voting patterns have noticed this for a long time. Early scholars who studied this believed that it was women's opinions that were changing, but now it seems more like it's men's political opinions that are changing. For example, from 1952 to 2004, the percentage of women identifying as Republican declined 5%. But during that same period of time, 1952 to 2004, the percentage of men identifying as Democrat declined 16%. So I've heard this as long as I've been interested in politics as an adult, but my question was, why? To me, it's not obvious that women would be more likely to vote Democrat and men would be more likely to vote Republican. Maybe some of you out there listening to this are thinking, of course it's obvious. The Democrats are more in favor of abortion rights, whereas Republicans are usually trying to repeal abortion rights. But here's the thing, I've seen some data showing that a lot of voters just don't vote based on abortion. So it's actually not obvious to me why this split happens. So I set out to find some answers, and what I found was that political scientists have lots of different theories. Let's look at each of them in turn. First is economics. Now, according to a lot of political theories, it just really doesn't make sense for there to be a gendered voting gap. A lot of political and economic theorists would predict that everyone in a household would probably vote the same. For example, if your household is poor, then maybe everyone in the household would vote in favor of welfare. So, for a lot of political scientists and economists, this is a puzzle. It doesn't make any sense why a man and a woman in the same household might vote differently. But the theory that tries to explain why this may be true points to divorce. Women started moving politically out of sync with their husbands in around the 1970s, which was coincidentally around the same time that divorce started rising in the United States. One of the big reasons why divorce started rising in the 1970s was because states started allowing no-fault divorce, which is divorce for any reason. So here's the theory. The partial socialization of family work, meaning that the government takes on some of the work of the family, even at the cost of higher taxes, increases a woman's ability to work outside the home and thereby increases her exit options, her possibility of divorce, and her household bargaining power if she stays in that household. So when women vote Democrat, they're supporting their own rights in lots of ways that have to do more with the welfare state, with Social Security, with Medicare and Medicaid, and a lot less to do with abortion, which is the issue that a lot of people focus on when they're thinking about women's rights. And in fact, this is supported by some data. Not every country in the world has this difference between how men and women vote. So if you look across the globe, the countries where women are more likely to vote in more liberal ways than men are also the countries that have high numbers of working women and high divorce rates. next theory is altruism. There is a theory out there that women are more altruistic than men, by which we mean giving, kind, supportive, focused on the community and cooperation, rather than men who are more individualistic and selfish. That's the theory. Now, I want to be very clear here that no one who talks about this theory is claiming that women and men are somehow biologically programmed to be different. Nobody thinks that's true. Men and women are socialized from the time they are very little, from the time they are girls and boys, to act differently and think differently by their culture. But these socialization patterns change from one culture to another. For example, you can find one culture that says that obviously women are just so much more talkative than men. Here in the United States, that's kind of a myth that floats around. Then you'll find another culture that says obviously men are more talkative than women. So the personalities that each culture expects men or women to adhere to are different from one culture to another. If you're raised from the time you are a very little kid being told, oh, you're so kind, girls are like that, or, wow, you're so independent, boys are like that, then you're likely to live up to whatever standard that culture is making up about who you're supposed to be. But it is definitely true that even though it's not biological, in the United States, women are raised, socialized to be less aggressive, to be friendlier, and more consensus seeking. Research has shown that in the United States, men prefer a strong candidate over a warm candidate, and women feel the opposite. Women prefer a warm candidate over a strong candidate. Researchers have also found that gendered nationalism predicts support for Trump. This is a statement like, I believe America has become too soft and too feminine. That's what gendered nationalism would be. Now, of course, saying that gendered nationalism predicts a vote for Trump doesn't necessarily mean that in all the other elections this difference existed, but researchers have found this difference just in the last election. So maybe the Democrats might be perceived as the party of warm, fuzzy feelings and helping other people. Maybe Republicans are seen as the strong party. And maybe it's these kinds of personality differences that men and women are socialized into that have made men and women vote differently. Along these same lines, some researchers point specifically to stigma and social harmony rather than altruism. Stigma is about being seen as a social outcast, and it turns out some political parties are very stigmatized. Extreme political parties usually have stigma around them. They're seen as political outcasts, and they may even face criminal prosecution for inciting hate. So researchers have looked at the extreme political parties, both on the left and the right, and found that men are much more likely to endorse extreme political parties than women are. Now, when they're looking at these extremes, it is true that men are even more overrepresented on the extreme right than they are the extreme left, but men are overrepresented in both the right and the left. In contrast, women tend to vote for parties that are seen as more like moderate and center parties. So the theory is that men are less sensitive to social stigma. These parties on the extreme ends, whether they're on the left or the right, are stigmatized. A lot of voters in the country are going to look at those parties and say, they're too extreme for me. We don't want to have anything to do with them. But when you're looking at all the people who are willing to overcome that stigma, to be willing to tell their neighbors or friends or acquaintances or family members that they're voting for this political party that a lot of other people view negatively, it's men who are able to overcome that social stigma more often. And the reason is because women tend to conform to the social cues of people around them a lot more. For example, when researchers made up a story about a certain kind of coffee and told women about this imaginary coffee, if they told women that a whole lot of other people were buying this coffee, women were a lot more likely to also say that they were going to buy this coffee. In contrast, when they did the same thing with men, telling the men that a whole lot of other people were buying this coffee, most of the men didn't care. It didn't change their perception at all of whether or not they were going to buy the coffee. So men are socialized to be less sensitive to other people's social cues and to try to want to conform and fit in a lot less than women are. Now, I want to be clear here. Stigma has an effect on all voters. Voters are a lot less likely to join parties that have a lot of stigma around them. It's just that scientists believe that the stigma affects women a lot more than it affects men. And the flip side of the stigma picture is the social harmony picture. Researchers believe that women are socialized to seek social harmony a lot more than men are. Women are taught from the time that they're very little to seek consensus and harmony and tolerance. Many societies socialize women to be more agreeable than men. Women are more socialized into communal behavior, and they're a lot more likely to define themselves in relation to other people. Extreme parties often aim to fundamentally change the social system, often through revolution. Extreme parties on the right are usually looking to overthrow the system of immigration and possibly kick all the immigrants out of the country. Extreme parties on the left are often looking for class revolution. But either way, extreme parties are usually not parties that you would associate with social harmony. Extreme parties have historically been associated with verbal and physical aggression. So if you have the sort of personality that is looking for harmony, you're not going to be attracted to these extreme parties, either on the left or the right. Now let's look specifically at political issues. There are lots of political scientists who claim that the issues that men care about are different than the issues that women care about. And this might explain why women are more likely to vote Democrat and men are more likely to vote Republican. For example, men are more anti-immigration because men's jobs are more threatened by immigrants than women's jobs are. Men's jobs are more threatened by deindustrialization than women's jobs. And by deindustrialization, I mean the loss of those factory and other industry jobs that a lot of men did here in the United States back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Men are more likely to favor law and order politics. Men are in favor of war more than women are. Men are more conservative on social welfare issues. According to exit poll data from the 2000 election, women tend to care more about education, healthcare, and childcare. Men tend to care more about taxes, the economy and jobs, and world affairs. So it may be that men and women just have different political issues that they're most interested in. Before we get too excited, though, thinking we found the complete picture of gender and voting patterns, let's throw a wrench in the gears. Statements like women vote Democrat and men vote Republican actually obscure the truth of what's really going on. While it's true on average, if you look on average at all men and all women, then a statement like that would be true. White people have different voting patterns than minorities do when you're comparing genders. Just looking at the 2016 election and seeing who voted for Trump, we can see that 52% of white women voted for Trump. Their numbers were actually pretty close to the number of men who voted for Trump at 62%. But if we look at other groups of women, only 4% of Black women voted for Trump, and 25% of Latina women voted for Trump. So just looking at this, you can easily see that it isn't actually completely accurate to just say women tend to vote Democrat. Instead, what is more accurate to say is minority women tend to vote Democrat. White women, the picture isn't so clear. In fact, white women's voting patterns are very similar to white men's voting patterns. Throughout this video, we've been talking about this like a gender divide, that men vote this way and women vote this way. But in fact, that gender divide disappears to some degree when you're looking at white women. The gender divide is still there, but it's not nearly so extreme as it is if you're looking at minority voting patterns. If you look at all the elections after the 2000 election, 59% of white men voted Republican. That's the average for all elections. And 54% of white women voted Republican. So you can see that when you break white women out, on average since the year 2000, white women have actually voted for Republicans more than they voted for Democrats. So why? Why are white women having such different voting patterns than all the other women in the United States? Well, you might not like the answer that I found, but whether you like it or not, it is supported by a lot of data. I was able to find multiple research papers that found very strong support for the fact that the answer is racism. Racial resentment is by far the most significant and consistent explanation for why white women vote the way that they do. White Southern women specifically are even more likely than all white women to endorse racist viewpoints. I found that many of the researchers kind of summed it up this way. For these white women, they're second in sex to men, but they're first in race to minorities. This is because white women tend to endorse both racism and sexism. White women maintain their own privilege by protecting and prioritizing their relationships with white men. The relationship between racist resentment and voting Republican is very strong. It's statistically significant in every model, and it is the strongest predictor of who voted Republican. Racial resentment is absolutely the best explanation for why white women are supporting Republicans. But was Trump really racist during the 2016 campaign? Yes, absolutely. He repeatedly criticized political correctness, which is a dog whistle for racism. He repeatedly claimed that Obama was a Muslim and not born in the United States. He made a statement calling all Mexican immigrants rapists and drug dealers. He proposed a ban on all Muslims. He made another statement that a Mexican American judge would be biased against him just because the judge was Mexican. He put out a tweet that claimed that 81% of all whites who were murdered by blacks, which is literally the exact opposite of reality. The reality is that about 80% of all white murder victims were murdered by other whites, according to the FBI's expanded homicide data from 2017. He claimed not to know who David Duke was. David Duke is the KKK Grand Wizard, and didn't immediately disavow him after David Duke endorsed him. So there are lots of reasons to think that if someone is harboring racist ideas in their heart, that they would probably support Trump. Let's summarize. Political scientists have a lot of different theories about why women on average are more likely to vote Democrat and men on average are more likely to vote Republican. Some of these theories are about economics and divorce, altruism, stigma and social harmony, and maybe men and women have different political issues that they're interested in. But before we get too excited about these differences between men and women voters, we should remember that white voters show a different pattern than everybody else does. White women vote primarily based on their race rather than based on women's issues.